In this video we are going to continue with the realistic portrait drawing guide, looking at how to draw in his clothes, and we'll also be adding in a background. So this is where we are at with the drawing up to now. Most of Walter White here has been rendered in pencil, everything except his shirt that he's wearing here, which is what we'll be drawing in this video. So let's start by looking at the reference image we are working from. I will put this up on screen as I draw, but before you start, it's always good to just look at what you are drawing first and think about how you are going to approach it. As you can see, there's this pattern on his shirt with lines in various directions that I'll likely start to outline first. I'll begin at this section to the left and start by drawing in those lines for the pattern on his shirt, making sure to curve these as they appear in the reference image. That's one thing to consider here, is the shape of these curves. As you can see, they are not straight, they curve and bend with the folds in his shirt. There's also a lot of creases in his shirt and folds which cast shadows, which we'll get to eventually. Once I have the pattern drawn out, I shade over this and move downwards to repeat what I had just done. There's also the stitching on his shirt at his shoulder, which I draw in here. Remember, the details matter here, we are not leaving out anything in this realistic drawing guide. I'm kind of breaking this down into sections here, drawing out the pattern before shading over the top of this. The lines that I make for the pattern on his shirt are quite bold, the same way as they are in the reference image. I'm not too concerned with adding in any shadows or creating a more realistic texture for his shirt at this stage. I'm just focusing on drawing in these lines correctly. They start to twist and curve a lot as I get closer to the buttons on his shirt where it's open. I also have to draw these on his collar. Here they curve with the shape of the collar. I think I'll focus on rendering this one side of his shirt because this process will just be repeated on the other side. So at this stage I've drawn out the lines on his shirt and now I'm adding in a lighter shade over all of this. I'm going to work on this in layers, so the next step here is to work over this with more detail, whilst also applying a little more pressure with the pencil, now that I'm happy with the position of these lines. I am still using a 2B pencil at this stage, and I've started at the collar here. Between each of these lines, I shade over the lighter shade that I had created on top of this, but I'm more deliberate as I do this now. Notice how this time my lines also follow the same direction as the shape of his shirt and the pattern that's on it. Along with working over the section between the pattern, I also darken these lines I had made. It's usually a case of every time you darken one section of a drawing, you then have to darken the surrounding areas to suit. It's like adjusting the brightness and contrast of an image. You have to consider the full drawing as a whole. As I progress towards the buttons on his shirt here, I draw these in, along with drawing the pattern and lines around them in detail. There's a lot of details to consider here as well, so just take your time. I even attempt to draw in the stitching on his shirt here, but don't worry too much about this at this stage, because I do work into that and touch it up later. Now next to this section there's some folds in his shirt which create some noticeable shadows, and I typically draw these in as I see them. I just apply more pressure with the pencil here to create a darker shade on top of what I've already drawn. So at this stage I've worked over this twice. As I said earlier, I am going to approach this in layers, so here I work over it again, except this time I did swap the 2B pencil for a 6B pencil, I believe. I made sure that the pencil was sharp, and then I started at the top here. This time I was working over the lines for the pattern again, but I was also creating a more realistic texture for the fabric on his shirt. Between these lines I was drawing in lines which followed the same shape, similar to before. You can see the difference a softer pencil makes, and we will be working into the drawing as a whole like this in a later video. You can see that as I work on this, I do adjust the marks I had made for the stitching on his shirt, and I also work over those shadows. So you can see how I'm following the shape of the collar as I shade over this and darken these areas. I also adjust that stitching on his shirt. So now we've gotten this shirt to a point that I'm happy with in terms of the values we've produced here by shading and working over this multiple times. One thing we are missing though is the lighter pattern, the white lines in between these darker ones. If we take a look at the reference image, you can see that there's this what looks like some circular dots in the middle of these squares and some lines between them in the same direction as the darker lines. To do this, we'll be relying on this eraser, the Mono Zero eraser. This is where a tool like this becomes really useful because you can accurately remove some of the pencil work like I do here. I start by creating that circle in the middle of all of these squares that I have drawn here. I try not to make these too obvious though, they are quite subtle on the reference image, so I want them to be the same here. Once I have these circles marked in, I then create some lines with this by erasing some of the pencil, like so. Again, be sure to follow the shape of his shirt. Once I've done this in one direction, I then do it in the other. So there we go, that's one side of his shirt drawn out, and this process is something that I repeat to finish the other side. Don't worry, I won't narrate this process again and repeat what I had just said, I'll just let this section play out in a time lapse. Again, now might be a good time to remind you that I do post all of my real-time drawing footage over onto the Patreon page for you to study in your own time, so be sure to check that out if it's something you'd find useful. So now I've nearly finished drawing in this side of his shirt as well, and you can see how it looks. I am happy with how this is at the moment. As I say in a later video, when I work into the drawing, I'll likely develop this further, but for now, we'll leave it as it is and move on to creating a background. So looking at the reference image we have been working from, you can see that this background is rather simple in that there's no details here. Instead we have this gradient where down towards his shoulders it's a very dark shade that gradually transitions into a lighter shade as we get to the top of the portrait, and so that's what we'll be recreating in our drawing. To begin, here I use the 2B pencil again to start shading in this side of the drawing. I keep the direction of my pencil strokes consistent, and I also aim to keep the amount of pressure that I apply with the pencil consistent, and then this is all in an effort to produce a smooth, untextured shade of pencil. Now as I get higher here, where it starts to lighten on the reference image, I do reduce the amount of pressure I apply, but I keep the direction of my pencil strokes the same. I'll focus on this one side at the moment. Now I come back down to where I started here, and whilst I do apply more pressure with the pencil now, I do work over this again, but instead I'm creating horizontal strokes with the pencil that are nice and tight together. By doing this you can see how not only do I produce a darker shade, but it also looks a lot neater. Now as I progress upwards, I do start to produce some lighter shades, but I repeat this motion with the pencil. Eventually I get all the way to the top, and then I decide to do the same at the other side, and so from the top here I work my way around. So just like when I was drawing out his shirt, I work on this in layers. Here I'm doing the same at this other side. Again, try and keep everything consistent here, but reduce the amount of pressure you apply with the pencil as you progress towards the top. Once that side is taken care of, I come back over to this side at the bottom and start to add another layer of shading on top. This time I create some diagonal strokes with the pencil, and again, the reason why with each of these layers I have my pencil strokes in different directions is because it helps me to create a smooth and consistent shade. We don't necessarily want to see our pencil strokes here. Again, because I'm working over this once more, I do apply more pressure, and I think at this point I am still using that 2B pencil. I will likely darken this background further once I have adjusted the rest of the drawing. As you can see, this has created a nice looking background, one consistent shade which gradually gets lighter towards the top. And so for now I'll leave it like this. That's our background drawn out. So that's all of this portrait drawn out now and rendered in detail, but we are not done yet, because in the next part I will be working into the drawing as a whole and making some final adjustments which will really bring the drawing to life. So until then, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.